Tell us about the Sedition Act of 1798 and how that came about. Was that really the beginning of the attacks on First Amendment speech?
Well, sure. The United States government, as we have come to know it, only came into existence a decade before, less than a decade before the Sedition Act of 1798. And the way the act came into existence was really the combination of two critical factors. First, there was a war raging in Europe at that time between the French and the English, and it was the English monarchy essentially fighting against the French Republic, and the two armies were locked in a life and death struggle. Within the United States, the second major development is that although the framers of the Constitution very much feared and opposed the ideas of faction or of political parties developing, they thought Americans would and should see themselves as individual Americans who would vote for candidates based on their individual qualifications, and the idea of creating parties was something they were very uneasy about. Nonetheless, within a matter of several years, political parties came into existence. The Federalist Party, which was most prominently represented by Washington, Adams, and Alexander Hamilton, was the dominant party at the time. Washington and Adams are the only two presidents the United States had known. They were both Federalists. The Congress was a Federalist majority, and all federal judges had been appointed by definition by Federalist presidents, because that's all we'd had. And the Federalists are, one might loosely think of them as somewhat analogous to modern-day Republicans. That is, they tended to be from the wealthier classes. They were more concerned with stability, both economically and politically, than they were with liberty or freedom. They were distrustful of democracy. They didn't have much confidence in the ability of the common man to contribute usefully to their own governance. And they were very much inclined to be supportive of the British. The Republicans, led by Jefferson and James Madison, were more representatives of the South, of the agrarian interests, of the common man, and very much inclined to think about the importance of liberty and democracy and freedom than of economic and political stability. So these two groups were very much at odds and had totally different visions for the future of the United States. They were deeply distrustful of one another, and they both feared for the future of the nation. And democracy, as we have come to know it, was an experiment. And they understood full well that it was an experiment, and they had no idea whether it would succeed or fail. And one of the things they feared most was exactly the development of these kind of fractious political parties that they feared would eventually divide the nation and cause it to splinter. And that was exactly what was happening. And the war in Europe inflamed all of this because the United States essentially tried to maintain a position of neutrality. It was a small new nation that didn't want to get involved in military actions with either England or France, but it wanted to maintain its commercial relationships with both. But it was impossible effectively to remain neutral because the English and French each wanted the United States to come in on their side. And eventually Adams signed a treaty with the English, joined the English side, and the French started more aggressively sinking American shipping that was headed to England. And so Adams finally came to Congress and basically stopped just short of seeking a declaration of war, but sought a larger military, larger army, larger navy, the freedom for American ships to sink French ships. And the Federalist Congress eagerly supported this and put the United States in a position where we're on the verge of war. This terrified the Republicans, who basically saw that by weighing in on the side of the British, that this was a step on the part of the Federalists to move the United States back towards monarchist and aristocratic tendencies and away from the Republican French. So in this context, with great suspicion, great fear, lots of fanfare, patriotic flags waving, the Federalists enacted the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. And what those acts did, the Alien Act of 1798 authorized the President of the United States to detain and to deport any non-citizen who the President found to be a possible threat to the security of the nation. And he could do this without giving the non-citizen any right to a hearing, any right to know the evidence against him, any right to challenge the evidence against him. It was a unilateral power assigned to the President. The Sedition Act of 1798 made it a criminal offense for any person to criticize the President, the Congress, or the government of the United States with the intent to bring the government, the Congress, or the President into contempt or disrepute. arguments the Federalists made about these two pieces of legislation in defense of the laws was that they were necessary for the United States in wartime. That is, the Anti-Alien Act was designed to assure that French spies and saboteurs and traitors could be removed from the country quickly and with expedition. And the Sedition Act, they argued, was necessary because if the United States was going to be in a state of military conflict, that it needed unity, that the people had to have confidence in their leaders, and that any criticism of the administration or the leadership of the nation would have the effect of undermining that confidence. But the real rationale for these laws, in fact, had little to do with the impending military conflict, which never actually came to being, but rather to do with the effort of the Federalists to destroy the Republican Party. And these acts were designed to do that in two ways. The Alien Act was designed because most of the new immigrants to the United States, and this was a period of very high immigration, tended to become quickly aligned with the Republican Party. And this was a way to both get rid of some of those people and also to deter any additional immigrants from coming into the United States by being very inhospitable to them. And the Sedition Act was obviously meant as a way to criticize, prosecute any individuals who criticized the Adams administration. And in fact, the Sedition Act was aggressively used by Federalist prosecutors and Federalist judges exclusively against the Republicans, against Congressman Matthew Lyon, who was a representative from Vermont, who was put in jail for giving a speech critical of the Adams administration, and to all of the major editors of Republican newspapers. And the Federalist goal was to essentially cripple the Republicans with an eye towards the 1800 election so that Adams would be reelected and that the Federalists could maintain their dominance. As it turned out, the American people revolted against the Alien and Sedition Acts. They elected Thomas Jefferson in 1800. Jefferson then pardoned all of those who had been convicted under the Sedition Act. The Federalist Party essentially disappeared shortly after that. 50 years later, the Congress repaid all of the fines that had been paid under the Sedition Act, and in the year since, the Supreme Court has consistently declared the Sedition Act of 1798 unconstitutional. And part of the importance of the last part of that story is that the history is not only a continued repetition of abusing civil liberties and First Amendment rights in these various episodes of wartime throughout our history, but it's also interesting that after each episode, we recognize that we behaved badly and that we, with the benefit of hindsight, look back and say we should not have done that thing that we did and try to avoid doing it again in the future. But in fact, we have had only very limited success in learning the lessons of our own history because the pressures that wartime creates are so great that we frequently give way to them, even though we may know from past experience that we tend to give way to them too easily.
Are there other examples where